Okay. I find the subject of fats highly interesting because I think that they are super complex, and it's actually how we metabolize fats is also super complex, and the liver is a big contributor to this metabolism, and it's my favorite organ. It does crazy things. So, so hopefully you also enjoy the topic of fats. I think it's something that has been poorly understood for a while, and as research elucidates more, it's starting to be a bit more understood, but we still have a lot to learn. So, here we go. Okay, so fats, you might also hear the term lipids. It's the same thing, kind of like sugars and carbohydrates go together. And we've got three types of fats in kind of the general, three general categories, and then we're going to dive deeper into those. Starting out with triglycerides. So triglycerides are, the way it looks molecularly is you have this glycerol backbone, and then you're going to have three fatty acid chains attached to it. And so that's where you get tri and then glyceride. You might hear it referenced as triacyl glyceride as well. It's the same thing. And so triglycerides are what actually produce ATP. So when we were talking about our energy systems, and we said that mitochondrial respiration uses fats, well, it uses these fatty acids to make ATP. And that's the type of fat that provides us energy. Also, triglycerides are when we are storing fat away in our body for later, it's in the form of triglyceride. And so it can get broken down and then reassembled in our body depending on whether we need to use it for energy or whether we need to store it because we don't need it. And also, pretty much like every fat, you'll see this as a theme, it contributes to every cellular structure. Like when we are, showering, we lose tons of skin cells. Even over the course of the day, we lose a lot of skin cells. And just that one example, we are producing new skin cells as well as other new cells in our body all the time. And so we're always needing the materials, like the brick and mortar, for these structures. And fats provide a lot of that, triglycerides as well. So let's just start with talking about triglycerides because it is, there's a lot of different types of triglycerides. So let's do this. Triglycerides are found in three forms in our food. We've got saturated, we've got monounsaturated, and then we've got polyunsaturated as well. So starting with the saturated type of triglyceride, this is where you get saturated fatty acids, saturated fat. This is what we're talking about here. You might see it as an acronym that looks like this, SFA. Saturated fats or saturated fatty acids are solid at room temperature. And so I will show you why. So in a triglyceride or in a fatty acid, it's basically made up of a bunch of carbons bonded together. It's a chain of carbons. And however many carbons there are, you can consider it a short chain, a medium chain, or a long chain. Long chains are typically 16 carbons or more. A medium chain is like, I think it's like 6 carbons to like 12 or 13 carbons in length. And then a short chain will be anything shorter than that, so less than 6 carbons. Now, in a saturated fatty acid, these carbons are all going to have single bonds to each other, and they're going to have a hydrogen bonded to each side of those carbons throughout the whole chain. And so this image right here is what a saturated fatty acid will look like all the way down all of those chains, okay? And it's called saturated because of that presence of hydrogen on both sides of those carbons. It's saturated with hydrogen. And because it's so evenly balanced and distributed and saturated with those hydrogens, that's what makes it seem solid at room temperature. There is no broken part of that chain. There is no interruption in the hydrogens. It's saturated. And so if they are put together, like in food, they pack nicely together. So examples would be your animal fats, so the fat that's on your steak. Those are solid, right? Animal fats. You also have animal product fats, so like butter and dairy fats. There are some plant fats that are saturated. You've got coconut oil and palm oil are examples of that. So I'm going to, right here, say that every carbon has a single bond and is fully saturated with hydrogen. So then we've got the monounsaturated fatty acids, or monounsaturated fat. The abbreviation for this is MUFA, monounsaturated fat. MUFAs are liquid at room temperature. And here is why. So they will look more like this. You're going to have a carbon bonded to another carbon, bonded to another carbon, and then all of a sudden, in one place within this chain, you're going to get this funky double bond to another carbon, okay? And what this does is it interrupts the bonding of those hydrogens. So you'll have hydrogen on this one, you'll have hydrogen on this one, and then you're just going to have a hydrogen right there, and then you're going to have hydrogen right there, and then it will continue on and be this regular shape throughout the rest of it. Make sense? So this double bond, or this kink in the chain, this interruption in the saturation of the hydrogen, is what makes it liquid at room temperature. It's not solid, it doesn't stack, it doesn't pack, and so it's going to be a more malleable substance, and therefore it's liquid. So monounsaturated fats are our plant oils. So this is olive oil, canola, peanut, safflower, got lots of these options, sesame. Monounsaturated fats are also found in avocados, a big source of MUFAs. They're found in a lot of nuts. Got almonds, hazelnuts, cashews, and then also some seeds like pumpkin seeds, and sesame seeds. We have abundance in our food of these monounsaturated fats. So now, polyunsaturated fats, what do you think the difference is here? You got it, multiple double bonds. So this one's gonna have a carbon, and a double bond, and then maybe even another double bond, and a carbon, and a carbon. And again, it's gonna interrupt that hydrogen and where it is bonded to the carbons. And so poly means more than one, and so there's gonna be more than one double bond in this fat. So polyunsaturated fats, again, are liquid, and their acronym is PUFA. We got MUFAs and PUFAs. They're liquid because of this interruption in the carbons. And polyunsaturated fats are what we have in our fish. So we got salmon, mackerel, those fatty fishes, tuna. And then there's also some found in corn oil and soy oil. There's even some in seeds, or I'm sorry, nuts. Walnuts have a lot of PUFAs. So the PUFAs are special though, because a type of polyunsaturated fat is considered essential in our body, which means that we do not produce it. We can't manufacture it, we can't take other things and create it. Any nutrient that's considered essential means that we have to eat it to have it in our body. We can't make it on our own. And so there are some specific fatty acids that are a polyunsaturated fatty acid that are essential. And those are our omega-6s and our omega-3s. You guys have heard of these, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, the essential fatty acids, the things that everyone likes to supplement. So let's talk about those. So omega-6s, so why is it called omega-6? So if you imagine you've got this chain of carbons, the last one is going to be considered the omega, it's Greek for the end. And so the double bond is going to be the last double bond is going to be 6 carbons back from that omega. That's what makes it called an omega-6 fatty acid. So examples of omega-6s are the soy oil and that corn oil that's mentioned right up there. And then a lot of just general vegetable oil. I have to sound that word sometimes to make sure I spell them correctly. So omega-6s are also considered linoleic acid, or LA. So you might see it written like this on a package, or linolenic, sorry, or LA. Now, the next one is that omega-3. What do you think the structure of that looks like? You got it. Yep. The last double bond there is 3 carbons back from the omega, which is the end. So omega-3s, there's actually 3 types of these, okay? So we've got, I'm going to botch these pronunciations. So it's alpha linolenic acid, or ALA. You've got icosapentaenoic acid, EPA. And you've got docosahexaenoic acid, THA. Whew, I did it. So let me write all these out. Hang tight here. So there's alpha linolenic acid, that's ALA. We've got Penta-aminoic acid. That's EPA. We've got DOCA, DOCOSA, wow. Watching that very hexaminoic acid, or DHA. Boom. Those are all of the omega-3s. So the ALAs are found in dark leafy greens, the dark greens. They're also found in flaxseed, in the oil of the flaxseed, also in walnuts. Now the EPA and the DHA, this is where the fish come in. These are in those fatty fishes like salmon, tuna, mackerel, and so on. Big trout even has it. Okay, so Americans typically get enough omega-6 in their diet, something that we are typically eating. However, studies show that Americans do not eat enough of the omega-3s. So there's this big craze of supplementation of the omega-3s. Who here has heard of supplementing with fish oil? Yep. So it actually is beneficial, and you can get these omega-3s from fish oil supplements because it's something that we don't eat that much of in America. So why are these important? So all of these, the LA, the ALA, EPA, and DHA, they're all precursors, meaning like they're providing these parts and pieces for this very, very important compound in our body called eicosanoids. And eicosanoids are basically responsible for proper cellular function of all of our cells. It's pretty imperative that we have plenty of eicosanoid in our body. So studies have shown that eicosanoids are linked to good GI motility, to proper blood pressure, to proper glucose management, to reductions in inflammation, and even proper blood cholesterol profiles. So, was it Tuesday? We talked about two things that kind of are the first steps to creating our problem in the nation of atherosclerosis. Who remembers those two things? So when we were talking about why chronic high blood glucose is bad for our vessels, it does two things that are essentially step one of the production of atherosclerosis. You got it, yeah. It damages the endothelial cells, and then that elicits inflammation. And so those two things, endothelial damage and inflammation, are the beginning of a lot of problems, but definitely step one to atherosclerosis. So why are these eicosanoids so important? Because it basically reverses and prevents those detrimental effects. So they're good for you, really, really good for you. Proper glucose management, sorry, that was my acronym there. Abbreviation. Okay, so there's one more type of saturated fat that we haven't talked about, and that is trans fats. So trans fats, the majority that are found in our food are industrialized production of them. They don't naturally occur in prevalence. Trans fats do exist in animal saturated fat. It is, however, less than, I think, 3% of the fat is actually in the transformation. But the majority that is in our food, hopefully no more, we'll talk about that, is industrialized, it's manufactured. So what happens? So trans fat means that a manufacturer has taken an unsaturated fat, something like corn oil or vegetable oil, and they will heat it up and they will pressurize it and essentially force hydrogen into a different configuration in that chain. And so what it does is it turns something that looks, say, like this, okay, into something that looks like this. So when a hydrogen is on the same side, say in this corn oil right here, it's considered in the cis formation, okay? And when it gets heated and pressurized or hydrogenated, you guys have heard of the term hydrogenated oils or partially hydrogenated oils, this is what's happening. And it's changing those hydrogens from a cis formation into a transformation. And that's where we get that term trans fat. And so what happens, and so this, an example of a trans fat would be like margarine or Crisco. And basically it turns it from an unsaturated fat into a saturated fat via this pressure and hydrogenation and heating. And so why did people do this, or why did manufacturers do this? Well, they discovered in the early 1900s that they could do this, and then they realized that it made all of these easy to spoil oils into a less spoil, like it basically extended the shelf life to whatever. I mean, like vegetable oil can sit on the shelf for years, you know, especially if it's hydrogenated. So it's to make fats less likely to spoil. And it's cheap. It's way cheaper than butter. It's way cheaper than lard, which is what a lot of food was fried in or cooked with before this manufacturing process was discovered. And so what happened was then it proliferated our food industry come the 1950s. And so in the 1950s, it started to be in everything. So like cookies, cakes, baked goods, fried, like French fries, any fried food. It was, what else did I write down that it's in? Oh, chips. Any fried food from fast food restaurants. They were using these trans fat oils to fry or to bake these foods. And so around the 1990s, scientists and dietitians started to get really skeptical of these trans fats, because what they were seeing was this exponential growth in the rate of atherosclerosis and heart disease in Americans. And they thought that, you know, we've got this whole low-fat craze, we've got, you know, all of these changes that they were trying to make to reduce heart disease, and all it did was get worse. We became, in general, more obese and more diseased. And so in the 90s, dietitians and researchers started to investigate it. And essentially, enough evidence accumulated that by 2015, 4 years ago, the FDA mandated that every food manufacturer remove trans fats from their food, because trans fats, the evidence showed that it was absolutely causal to arteriosclerosis, which is a stiffening of the arteries, which then causes high blood pressure, causes inflammation, causes that lipid and plaque buildup, and atherosclerosis, and heart disease. So trans fats, because they go from this unsaturated fat to this manufactured saturated form, they basically get embedded into the cell wall, and they don't have any other function but to make that cell wall rigid and unmalleable, impermeable, and inflamed. And so when this happens in your endothelial cells, which is the first place that these fats that you just ate reach the bloodstream, it just completely destroys those endothelial cell walls and makes them stiff, makes your vessels stiff. Therefore, your blood pressure increases, inflammation increases, endothelial damage is a result, and then the cascade of events that happen after that. So this evidence was overwhelming that these trans fats were absolutely linked to heart disease. So the FDA told all manufacturers to remove it from their food. However, they gave them 3 years. And so it wasn't until last summer that actually the deadline was met. So FDA mandated removal by mid-2018. So it's been on the nutrition label for a while. However, I have a feeling, I hope, that maybe it won't even need to be on there anymore because it won't even be existent in our food. The one thing, though, about this mandate removal, first of all, it was just last summer. That was the deadline. The second is that manufacturers are allowed to say 0 trans fats on their nutrition label if it contains less than 1 gram of trans fat per serving. So it still can have some trans fat in that serving and still say on the label 0 grams. So how do you know? You gotta look at the ingredients. Anything that says hydrogenated, that's got trans fats in it. And so Even if it says zero trans fats, but it says hydrogenated oil, it's gonna be trans fat, okay? So, crazy, right? Alrighty. I'm going to slide this over. Is that alright? Got it on video? Okay.
Yeah.
And let's finish up our conversation by talking about these other two types of lipids. We talked about triglycerides. All of that was all triglycerides. And so now we're going to talk about, let's do phospholipids. So, phospholipids look like this. You've got a phosphate and you've got two fatty acids attached. And who recognizes that shape, right? If you've had bio as a 150 or 151, hopefully it's not foreign to you. So this is essentially the lipid bilayer that makes up the cell membrane of every cell. Phospholipids do. And so we actually get them in our food. So, whoops. Phospholipids are found in egg yolks, milk fat, liver. Who likes to eat liver? Yeah, I've had it once, and I think if I didn't know what it was, I would have enjoyed it. I think I could find a liking for it. I hear it's really good for you. Wheat germ. Also, you'll find it in soy products. So, how do you know your food has phospholipids in it? Well, if it's one of these foods, obviously it does, but you can also recognize it in the ingredient list if it says lecithin. Lecithin is a thickening agent that's added to food, and it usually comes from one of these sources, and it's the phospholipids that are added to make it that kind of thicker texture. So lecithin is phospholipids. So it's important, right? Because we have a bazillion cells, and these phospholipids make up that membrane. Also, phospholipids are important for providing structure to our lipoproteins. We're going to talk more about lipoproteins on Tuesday next week. However, I'll introduce it to you. So when you eat fat, digest, goes into your intestines, and then you are to absorb it into your blood. It can't just go into the blood by itself. It's got to be packaged in a little suitcase because it is not dissolvable in water. And that suitcase is your lipoprotein. So lipoprotein has phospholipids in its structure, and so we use them to create those little suitcases that carry the fats around to the rest of the body. Phospholipids also supply an essential mineral, phosphorus. Who knows what body part uses phosphorus? Bones, you got it. Healthy, strong bones need phosphorus. And so these phospholipids also provide that. All right, last one, sterols. So sterols, this is what the structure of a sterol looks like. Instead of it being a carbon chain, it's basically just a carbon ring. And this is just, I would say, like a portion of what it would look like. There would be several rings in all different, configurations. So, but you can see that they're bonded like that in more of a ring shape than a chain shape. So sterols are found in animals and in plants. So for animal sterols, it's basically the cholesterol that's in an egg or the cholesterol that's in your beef or your chicken, whatever it is. So you can get animal